Good morning, homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back to my kitchen. And today we are going to make mac and cheese. And if you are new to cooking and you're just trying to get away from convenience prepackaged foods with long lists of ingredients that some of which you don't even recognize, mac and cheese can seem really intimidating. It's one of those super easy convenience foods that you think to yourself, oh, that's way too complicated to make at home. It is not. It is really, really easy to make mac and cheese at home. It doesn't take more than a couple of minutes, and you can definitely play with it, change up the types of cheese that you're using, change up the way it's being thickened, and do it as a one-pot meal on the stove. You can do it as a baked mac and cheese in the oven. I've tried many, many, many variations over the years. And the recipe that I'm going to show you uses evaporated milk and a little bit of cornstarch to thicken the mac and cheese, rather than using what's called a roux, which is when you take fat and flour and mix it together and cook it and then add the other ingredients. That's how you make a traditional French cheese sauce. And a roux totally works, but it adds a little bit more fat. Including cornstarch in this mix instead of using flour actually keeps the cheese from easily breaking and separating apart into basically kind of greasy globs. And so I like using that cornstarch partly because it's a little bit less fat in the recipe, and also partly because it tends to make it pretty much foolproof in terms of not accidentally having it break. In this recipe, I was kind of cleaning out the fridge, and I recently saw a video, I think from Ethan Chbosky, but they were talking about the best mac and cheese as a combination of cheeses rather than one cheese, and that including something like a sharp cheddar for flavor is fantastic, but sharp cheddar is not going to be ooey gooey, and so you want to include something else that's going to be a melty cheese in order to get a really great consistency along with really great flavor. I happen to have some Boursin, which is a flavored kind of cream cheese type mix, in my fridge. And so I decided to include some Boursin in this recipe as the cheesy kind of ooey gooey component, the creamy component, and it worked out beautifully. And then some sharp cheddar cheese. And then I also threw in a little bit of some grated Romano cheese that I happen to have in the fridge just for an extra flavor boost. So this was a little bit of a cheese clean out. I've done this with many different kinds of cheese over the years. I used to work as a vendor at farmers markets, and there was a friend of mine who was a cheese vendor, and he would have lots and lots of cut up little blocks of cheese as samplers during the farmers market. And at the end of the market, he would just have leftover samples, and he would just bag them all up into one bag. So all the different types of cheese going into one bag, and he would just give it to one of the other vendors. And one day he asked me if I wanted it, and my comment was, every time you ask me this question, I feel like I've won the lottery. So I would come home and make mac and cheese from his cheese samples, and it was just a random mix of a whole bunch of different kinds of cheese, and it was always absolutely delicious. So don't feel like you have to be married to certain types of cheeses in this recipe. If you like to eat them, they're going to be tasty. I don't know if I would do mozzarella, just because mozzarella is so stringy and a little bit rubbery in terms of that melty quality, that I don't know if it would work great in mac and cheese. I tend to stay away from mozzarella. But other than that, the sky is the limit. Play around with different kinds of cheese and see what you like. And then, of course, because this is a farming and gardening channel, I am going to throw some farm fresh veg in this recipe. That's totally optional. But what I ended up putting in here was some broccolini, some Chinese sprouting broccoli, and then also a little bit of kale. Peas are kind of the classic, and so frozen peas are also delicious. But this time of year, I am just swimming in garden greens and garden goodness, and so I just chopped those things up. I did blanch them a little bit in the cooking water for the noodles as a way of getting them relatively cooked through without having to saute them, because otherwise they're just not going to get tender fast enough in the cooking and baking time. But you can throw in whatever vegetables you like. Spinach would be a wonderful addition. Chard would be great. Kale is good. Peas are great. Broccoli, of course, is lovely. But whatever you happen to have on hand is fair game. And throwing some green chilies in this mix, which I often do later in the season when I have green chilies on hand, is absolutely delicious. So sky's the limit, and you can definitely add in some nutrition to your mac and cheese pretty easily and still keep it pretty simple. So homemade mac and cheese, let's get started.
We had a friend visit from out of town last weekend, and in an effort to not show up empty-handed for dinner, he brought us this artisan loaf of Asiago bread from a local grocery store. And so I am just going to make breadcrumbs out of this leftover bread to go on top of the mac and cheese. Totally optional, and breadcrumbs out of a canister from the store also work, but I just wanted to use up this bread, and so this is showing you how to make quick breadcrumbs. These were nicely flavored because there was already some cheese in the mix. Part of this went onto the mac and cheese, and then the rest of it I just spread out on a cookie sheet and threw into a low oven for about a half an hour, and then turned the oven off and let it just sit in there and dry out for another hour or so. And I now have my own homemade breadcrumbs in my cupboard that will be shelf stable forever and that I can use for meatballs or whatever else I need breadcrumbs for. I am using the Azure Standards shell pasta on this. You could obviously use just regular actual macaroni. I like the shells because they hold the sauce. And then this is a mix. It's about almost 5 ounces of a sharp cheddar, a little bit of Romano to get up to 5 ounces, and then 3 ounces of the Boursin. Here is our beautiful broccolini from the garden. And I'm just going to give that a nice fine chop. And this is technically, it's not broccolini, it's a Chinese sprouting broccoli, but we know it as broccolini when we see it in the store, and so that's what I call it. Broccolini is actually a patented seed, and so if you've ever wondered why you can't find seed for broccolini, that is why. It is definitely something that you have to have permission to plant, which just seems crazy. But I love Chinese broccoli, and I plant this every year as a early spring crop, and it's just delicious. And then it's done by mid-June, and I pull the plants out and move on to something else. So we've got our water boiling. There's some nice salt in there. You should always salt your pasta water. Adding in our shells, and I'm using 8 ounces of pasta here just because it's a half a pound, and that's 4 servings, and that's just about where I want to be. Bringing that to a boil. And then about 2 minutes before that pasta is going to be done, I'm adding in some of that chopped kale and my chopped broccolini. And so that last 2 minutes of cooking time for the pasta, I'm also blanching my vegetables. This is nice. It saves an extra pot. You don't have to saute it. And then this was some garlic spread that was also brought with this bread. And so I ended up melting a little bit of that and throwing it on there. You could just use melted butter. That's typically what you do. Or you can just leave it off and just use breadcrumbs. You don't have to have buttered breadcrumbs. Drain your pasta. Cool it off. And then into that same pasta pot, we're going to make our sauce. So this is 1 can of evaporated milk, not sweetened condensed, but just regular evaporated, and then 3/4 of a cup of regular 2% milk. And then I'm adding in some seasonings. The description for this recipe is below. A little bit of mustard, a little bit of cayenne, a little bit of salt. And then I always forget that the cornstarch needs to be dissolved in some of that milk, so I ended up picking a little bit more of it out while it was still cool, and then dissolving that cornstarch in the container. Bring that up to a simmer. And then we're going to add our cornstarch slurry, and that is going to continue to thicken this up. I believe it was 2 teaspoons of cornstarch, so not a lot. And then once that's thickened a little bit, under very low heat or off heat entirely while things are piping hot, you're going to start adding in your cheese. And you want to add a little bit at a time, just so it has time to melt before you add the next batch so that it doesn't clump up. And I'm kind of breaking up that Boursin so that it dissolves and melts into that sauce. And then I was just not feeling it, and so I just dumped in all of our cheddar at once. Not always recommended for making a cheese sauce, but it worked out fine in this particular case. That nice thing about that Boursin is it was flavored as well, and so I've automatically got some extra seasoning in here in terms of garlic and herb, just because that Boursin was seasoned, so it was a nice extra flavor bomb. And there is our beautiful cheese sauce ready for our pasta. And then in goes the pasta. Give everything a good stir to coat. And then at this point, this is ready. You do not have to bake it. You can just do a stovetop mac and cheese and serve this up as is right now. I wanted to get a little bit of a crispy breadcrumb crust on here. And so I went ahead and baked this for a little bit, but totally unnecessary if you're in a hurry. And so literally this sauce comes together. It takes longer to grate the cheese and cook the pasta than it does to put together the cheese sauce. This is a nice casserole dish that I've had since we got married 26 years ago. I remember that only because it was on my list of things that I was looking for as gifts. And then I'm going to top that with our buttered breadcrumbs. In this case, our garlicky buttered breadcrumbs on our cheesy bread. So kind of a nice combination there. Spread that out. And then I baked this, I think, in a 350-degree oven for 20-25 minutes, just long enough for it to become heated through and to get a little bit of color on that topping. Yum. And then we're ready to serve it up. This is so good, you guys, and so easy and has so many variations. Like literally, you could just do a million different kinds. So a wonderful, quick, easy weeknight dinner that is going to make almost everybody in your family happy. And there you have it. Give this recipe a try, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.